Today, we're in lesson 9 of our course, Understanding the Old Testament, and we're looking at the second of 2 lessons on the poetry and wisdom books. Now, I just want to remind you guys, as always, in the description of this lesson, you can find a link where you can download a copy of the PDF worksheet that we work on throughout this lesson. And we always end the lesson by looking over the questions in the worksheet. I also oftentimes provide charts, maps, graphs, those sort of things in the worksheet. So make sure that you download that. And I will also be giving you some homework to work on throughout the week. Last time we looked at Job, which taught about perseverance in suffering, and Psalms, which is Israel's hymn book and prayer book. Today we're going to be looking at Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. While Job and Psalms reflect humanity's appeals, prayers, and hymns to God, the remaining poetic books, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs, represent God's appeals and exhortations to humanity to live in a wise and righteous manner. The 5 poetry or wisdom books taken together can be considered a conversation with God. That is, humanity talks to God in Job and in Psalms, and God talks to humanity in Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. Looking first at the key facts and characteristics featured in Proverbs. Parallelism characterizes this book. In the longest part of the book, so this is chapter 10, verse 1 through chapter 22, verse 16, most Proverbs are 2 lines that show contrast or comparison. Some of the Proverbs use numbers for emphasis. For example, Proverbs 6:16 tells us there are 6 things the Lord hates, 7 that are detestable to him. And Proverbs 30, verse 18 tells us there are 3 things that are too amazing for me, 4 that I do not understand. In ancient Near Eastern cultures, Proverbs, which are short sayings, generally tend to teach about life. They were quite common and they remain popular in many cultures today. One thing that we have to remember, however, is that Proverbs are intended only as generalizations and not necessarily hard, fast rules. Although many Proverbs describe the result of an action or characteristic, Proverbs are not laws. They are not guarantees. Rather, they describe what usually happens. In other words, the results of a proverb are not guaranteed or automatic. They are not absolute. Still, a wise person heeds the warnings and instructions that are found in the pages of Proverbs. The Proverbs included in the Bible are didactic in nature. This means that they are designed and intended to teach the common citizen, specifically the believer. And they're to teach them the best and the wisest way to live. The Proverbs apply to all cultures. Looking at the authorship and date of the book of Proverbs, just as David wrote many psalms, his son Solomon spoke 3,000 proverbs and wrote 1,005 songs. Many of his wise sayings are preserved in the book of Proverbs. The book contains several references to Solomon's role in the proverb traditions of Israel. The Proverbs in chapter 10, verse 1 through chapter 22, verse 16 are called the Proverbs of Solomon. And those of chapters 25 through 29 are more Proverbs of Solomon. They were copied by the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah. The opening verse of the book associates the whole collection with Solomon. The evidence implies that Solomon composed much of the material in the book of Proverbs. Contributions of other wisdom teachers were attached to Solomon's collection because he was the motivation and the supporter of the Israelite wisdom tradition. Other authors named in Proverbs are Agur in Proverbs 30 and King Lemuel in Proverbs 31. Proverbs 22, verse 17, and Proverbs 24, verse 23 indicate that others may have contributed their wise sayings as well. Although most of the Proverbs seemingly came from Solomon, the entire book of Proverbs, as we have it today, was probably compiled during the time of King Hezekiah. So this would be around 700 BC. Remember that Hezekiah led Judah in returning to the God of their forefathers. Part of this reform involved directing specific individuals to gather and organize the Proverbs of Solomon and others into a collected work. The outline of Proverbs in your worksheet can be broken into 7 parts. So, chapter 1, verse 1 through 7 shows us the purposes and theme of Proverbs. Chapter 1, verse 8 through chapter 9, verse 18 are wise sayings for youth. Chapter 10, verse 1 through chapter 22, verse 16 are the main collection of Solomon's wise sayings. And chapter 22, verse 17 through chapter 24, verse 34 are wise sayings from other wise men. Chapter 25, verse 1 through 29, verse 27 are Solomon's wise sayings that were recorded by Hezekiah's scribes. Chapter 30, verse 1 through chapter 31, verse 9 are wise sayings of Agur and Lemuel. And then chapter 31, verses 10 through 31 is the epilogue, wise sayings about the virtuous wife. So let's look at each of these. First, we have the purpose and theme. The purpose of this book is stated clearly in Proverbs chapter 1, verses 2 through 6. The Proverbs were compiled to promote wisdom, understanding, and discipline, to encourage individuals to do what is right, just, and fair, to give wisdom to the unlearned, to teach youth to discern what is right, and to help the wise become wiser. Then the editor identifies the theme of the book. In chapter 1, verse 7, he says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline." He emphasizes the theme again in Proverbs 9:10. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. In this sense, to fear God means to respect, honor, and obey him. Wisdom does not depend on a person's degree of intellectual ability or educational achievements. Rather, wisdom has its source in God and God alone, much more than intellectual information or head knowledge. The instruction found in this book is based on the reverence and the worship of Yahweh. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. As its beginning, the fear of God is the first and controlling principle of wisdom. While the entire book of Proverbs contains a variety of contrasts, the contrast between wise living and foolish living is repeatedly emphasized. There are those who reject God's laws and refuse to keep his covenant. And Proverbs designates these individuals as fools and their life choices as folly. On the other hand, those who carefully maintain their relationship with God and adhere to his ways are called wise, and their lives are characterized by wisdom. The book of Proverbs focuses on these three major matters. First, the secret of a happy, meaningful, and effective life is found in wisdom and the practical application of its principles. Second, wisdom comes only from knowing and confessing God as its source. Third, a person must seek after God with all of his or her being in order to be wise and enjoy wisdom's benefits. Second, we have the wise sayings for youth. So again, this is chapter 1, verse 8 through chapter 9, verse 18. Several of the speeches in this section begin with the phrase, my son, or my sons, indicating that an older, wiser father is instructing his son. The father's counsel involves exhortations to appropriate living and warnings about unwise living, as well as considerations about sexual purity and sexual immorality. This language is also often used between teacher and pupil. The Proverbs often engage a literary device called personification, in which a concept or idea is represented as a person. For example, in Proverbs 1, wisdom is personified as a woman. In chapter 1, verse 20, we read, wisdom calls aloud in the street. She raises her voice in the public squares. Later, the characteristic of folly or foolishness is also represented by a woman. The first woman, Folly, is a street corner prostitute. This seductress appears in Proverbs 2, verses 16 through 19, 5, verses 3 through 20, 6, verses 23 through 35, 7, verses 6 through 27, and 9, verses 13 through 18. She glitters with flattery and seductive charm, but she drags her young victim into a dark death. The second woman, Wisdom, the street preacher with a prophetic message, is the soul's true bride, true counselor, true hostess, and the very offspring of the Creator. This section describes folly in terms of sexual immorality, but it also speaks of other temptations that young men are prone to, such as gang violence, mockery, or even laziness. Third, we have the main collection of Solomon's wise sayings, chapter 10, verse 1 through chapter 22, verse 16. Solomon's Proverbs address God's sovereignty along with many other subjects, including poverty and wealth, slander, self-discipline, speech and silence, work and laziness, rash promises, discipline in education, sickness and grief, old age, and more. The contrasts in some of these topics are examples of the antithetical or opposite form of parallelism. This unit consists largely of a collection of proverbial sayings in poetry of 2 lines each. The parallelism is almost always antithetical, as in chapter 10, verse 1, a wise child makes a glad father, but a foolish child is a mother's grief. We also have wise sayings from other men in chapter 22, verse 17 through chapter 24, verse 34. So this 4th section contains a series of more advice and warnings from wise men other than Solomon. These proverbs frequently use the phrase "do not" in warning against such things as oppressing the poor, spending too much energy on becoming rich, envying sinners, or rejoicing when the wicked fall. They also address wise actions such as trusting in God, demonstrating respect for authority, and working hard. The 5th section are the Proverbs of Solomon that Hezekiah's scribes preserved and collected. This is in chapter 25, verse 1 through chapter 29, verse 27. The collection contains some variety, including sayings about proper priorities, as well as the fate of the sluggard. These proverbs appear to have captured Hezekiah's interests because of his intention to bring spiritual reformation to the nation of Israel. They frequently deal with topics of leadership and those who associate with leaders. Then there are the wise sayings of Agur and Lemuel in chapter 30, verse 1 through chapter 31, verse 9. Now, the Bible says very little about Agur and Lemuel. Agur confesses that he does not have great wisdom and understanding, yet he wants God to teach him wisdom and keep him from deception. He learns much by observing creation, specifically animals, as well as human life and interaction. Lemuel recounts principles his mother taught him about a king's responsibilities. His proverbs encourage leaders to guard against negative influences, specifically sexual immorality and drunkenness, and to treat all people fairly without favoritism. Finally, there are the wise sayings about the virtuous wife. This is in chapter 31, verse 10 through 31. The last chapter of Proverbs includes a well-known discourse about the virtue and inner beauty of a woman who honors God. The woman of noble character is wise, generous, hardworking, and a wonderful gift from God. These 22 verses form an acrostic poem. That is, each verse begins with a different letter of the Hebrew alphabet. The last 2/3 of Proverbs 31 is an A to Z description of an ideal wife. She cares for the husband, family, and home. She strengthens the family economy through real estate purchases and sales of homemade crafts. She guides her household well. She cares for the poor. She is certainly praiseworthy. These remarkable standards are not an exhortation demanding that a young woman become a super wife, Rather, they encourage a young man to choose a wife carefully, seeking qualities reflected in wisdom rather than in folly. This final poem is a fitting epilogue or conclusion to Proverbs because of the family's central place in the book. After all, the family had a central place in Israel from the earliest days. The Proverbs expose, warn against, and condemn sins that destroy the family. Therefore, it is fitting that the book should end by praising a wife who is known for her good qualities. So that brings us to the book of Ecclesiastes. Looking at the authorship and date of the book of Ecclesiastes, a number of traditional Jewish and Christian interpreters attribute the authorship of this book to Solomon. Some of these scholars believe that Solomon wrote the book after he had turned away from God. However, the evidence that Solomon authored Ecclesiastes is rather inconclusive. Most scholars, including conservative ones who affirm the inspiration of Scripture, admit that we do not know who wrote Ecclesiastes, and that even the internal evidence in the book itself is not sufficient enough to arrive at a firm conclusion. The phrase "son of David, king in Jerusalem," and certain passages, like chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, are clearly meant to remind the reader of Solomon. Yet the boast that he had surpassed all who preceded him on the throne is rather weak if his father David was his only predecessor. Since the book nowhere claims Solomon as its author, it's better to leave the matter unsettled. The date of the book's writing is uncertain as well. Some scholars point to a rather late date because of perceived Aramaic type sayings. However, others point out that since these sayings are also found in pre-exilic literature, an early date is certainly conceivable. Some have suggested a date around 930 BC, but again, it is best to leave the matter unsettled. While the author and date of Ecclesiastes may be uncertain, the theme of the book, stated twice, is definite. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. The word meaningless occurs 35 times in the 12 chapters of this book. In the Hebrew scriptures, the phrase in Ecclesiastes 1:2 is vanity of vanities. Remember that this form of writing identifies the greatest of a group. For example, the Holy of Holies is the holiest place in the temple, and the King of Kings is the greatest king. Therefore, the vanity of vanities indicates that life without God is the most meaningless, empty thing of all. The writer of Ecclesiastes had learned that life without God is empty, useless, and meaningless. Because Ecclesiastes is filled with these negative statements about life, some question the book's value and inclusion in the biblical canon. They wonder how such statements like everything is meaningless can be inspired by God. Yet these individuals fail to see the negative comments within the book's entire context. The unusually pessimistic statements in this book must be understood as the musings of a person attempting to think and to live apart from divine revelation. Although Satan's words in the book of Job are part of the inspired record, his words themselves are not inspired. In the same way, the sayings in Ecclesiastes are part of the inspired record. but we must not assume them to be theologically accurate or inspired. Rather, the negative statements reflect the common wisdom of individuals who do not serve God. With so many negative and theological inaccuracies in the book, how can we say that Ecclesiastes is God's appeal to humanity to live wisely and in accordance with his purpose and plan? This assertion comes from examining the book's context, theme, and purpose. Like Proverbs, Ecclesiastes contrasts worldly wisdom with divine wisdom. In addition, the book affirms that our lives must be God-focused. Ecclesiastes warns against a life caught in the pursuit of absurd and empty pleasures that have no lasting value. Life without God at the center is meaningless. Ecclesiastes demonstrates the emptiness of living by human wisdom and searching for meaning apart from God. Not all of the observations in Ecclesiastes are negative, however. Its positive statements support the wise actions of those who place God at the center of their lives. It acknowledges some of God's gifts and claims that God has made everything beautiful in its time. While the author of Ecclesiastes knows that life involves many empty, vain, and useless things, he also knows that some values give meaning to life. Thus, he encourages his readers to discern between what has value and what is useless. I've placed the outline of Ecclesiastes in your worksheet, and it can be broken down into 10 parts. However, in order to see the big picture, we're going to look at the two main ideas. The problem in chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 11, verse 6, and the solution in chapter 11, verse 7 through chapter 12, verse 14. Ecclesiastes 1:1 through 11:6 introduces the problem that life without God is without meaning. That is, life lived with a view only of this world is meaningless. But with an eternal perspective, you can find joy and meaning in creation. The author of Ecclesiastes experienced many things: wisdom, wit, wine, works, wealth, women, worldly fame, and worldly pleasure. But without God, nothing truly satisfied his quest for meaning in life. Nevertheless, while the book proclaims the meaninglessness of life without God, it also confirms that every good thing in life is a gift from God. For instance, since God created the sun, the moon, and the stars, all good things, they are meant to be enjoyed as God's creation. Yet, creation cannot satisfy humanity's deepest need. Only the Creator can satisfy. The futility of satisfying oneself with created things will keep a person in a meaningless cycle of life. Ecclesiastes 11:7 through 12:14 gives us the solution. The writer concludes the book with a poem about old age and encourages youth to recognize God early in life. If we please God and obey Him while we live, we will rejoice to face Him when we die. Believers wrestle with some of the same questions and dilemmas that Ecclesiastes addresses. All of us must come to understand that our perplexing questions about life have no easy answers. Like the book of Job, Ecclesiastes refuses to dodge the hard questions of life and does not allow easy solutions. The comfort lies in acknowledging God's sovereignty and control in every circumstance. Ecclesiastes alludes to this in spite of the repetitive cycles and apparent meaninglessness of life. So, what mindset should we read the entire book with? In the end, the narrator provides his key to the interpretation of this book. In chapter 12, verses 9 through 14, we see his conclusion of the matter. Not only was the teacher wise, but he also imparted knowledge to the people. He pondered and searched out and set in order many proverbs. The teacher searched to find just the right words, and what he wrote was upright and true. The words of the wise are like goads, their collected sayings like firmly embedded nails, given by one shepherd. Be warned, my son, of anything in addition to them, of making many books there is no end, and much study wearies the body. Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. So he issues neither absolute denial nor approval of the teacher. We are to respect the teaching of the first person spokesman. At the same time, we must be cautious and critical of his conclusions. We must remember that Ecclesiastes was not meant to emphasize repentance or to present a detailed systematic theology from God's own perspective. Rather, the primary purpose was to establish that life under the sun cannot offer fulfillment. The philosophy expressed is not simply enjoy life, but enjoy life and fear God. This is not abandonment of all for a life of pleasure. It is a responsible, optimistic integration of life and faith. The result is that few books of the Bible offer as clear a challenge to our contemporary Western worldview. Enjoyment of life comes not in the quest for personal fulfillment, but in the recognition that everything comes from the hand of God. Moving on into our final book in the poetry and wisdom books, there are some key characteristics worth noting about the Song of Songs. As mentioned in Ecclesiastes, phrases such as King of Kings emphasize supremacy or superiority, so that King of Kings refers to the greatest king. Thus, Song of Songs means the greatest song. Some Jewish and Christian scholars believe that it was composed to be sung at weddings and is the greatest wedding song ever written. It is one of the 5 scrolls in the Holy Writings, which is the third part of the Hebrew Scriptures. The Jews publicly read the book at the Feast of Passover. Throughout the centuries, the explicit sexual imagery and the words of Song of Songs have disturbed many and discomforted some. This has resulted in a variety of perspectives regarding the book's intents and interpretations. Some wonder whether the book should be included in the canon of Scripture at all. Others have explained the images away by proposing various allegorical or typological interpretations. For the purpose of our study, however, we will consider 3 views concerning Song of Songs. In the beginning, Jews did not attempt to discover so-called hidden meanings in Song of Songs. Rather, they believed the book was about the beauty of sexual intimacy in marriage. In the Garden of Eden, before sin entered the world, God created Adam and Eve. Neither he nor they were embarrassed that the humans were naked. God saw that all he had made was very good, including human sexuality. Therefore, to the Israelites, Song of Songs celebrated the love of a husband and wife. Human sexuality is a gift from God that, like anything else, can be used properly or it can be abused. Physical and emotional joy in marriage was God's idea. It was for this reason that the Jews recited Song of Songs at each Passover feast. Later, some individuals thought that the book's focus on the beauty of the human body was sinful and that it promoted lustful thoughts. So they developed what they believed to be a more spiritual way to read the book and promoted it as a symbol of God's love for Israel. This is an example of a more allegorical or typological approach to interpretation. In doing so, however, these individuals chose to ignore the book's historical background as well as its more obvious literal sense. In the first century AD, one rabbi began to teach that the Shulamite woman represented the nation of Israel. And throughout the years, other rabbis began to follow suit. Although the New Testament never quotes from the books of Esther or Song of Songs, it appears that in agreement with the Jews, the early believers saw Song of Songs as a book about love in marriage. Then, about AD 200, a man named Hippolytus said that the bride in Song of Songs stood for the church. And in the 3rd century, a church leader named Origen greatly emphasized allegory, a literary device that uses symbols to represent truths about life. That is, he tried to find a hidden spiritual meaning in almost everything. With these historical perspectives in mind, how should believers today view Song of Songs? The best way to interpret this book is in its literal, natural sense, which affirms and encourages the celebration of sexual relations within the bonds of marriage. Song of Songs upholds the fact that sex between a husband and wife is a gift from God. The sexual imagery in the Song of Solomon is straightforward love poetry. But Jewish and Christian interpreters have labored to find a more spiritual message in the book. However, to choose a natural approach to the book does not mean that we must adopt a non-theological perspective. It is often argued that such themes are unworthy of being treated in Scripture, since the focus of biblical material is on the redemption from sin, and by definition, sexuality is sinful. However, even a casual reading of the Old Testament should reveal that this equation was never made by the biblical writers. It is illicit sexuality that is condemned, not sexuality per se. From the creation story in Genesis to the marriage of the Lamb in Revelation, human sexuality is presented as a specific gift from God to his creation. The creation of mankind in the image of God created male and female as sexual beings for the purpose of procreation, fellowship, mutual support, and dependence, and physical as well as spiritual unity. Should be clear evidence that God's action of creating us as sexual beings was no accident or compromise. It was the divine intention from the beginning and is, in fact, good. Although some believers try to avoid the topic of sex altogether or claim that all sex is sinful, the Bible takes a pure and a balanced approach to sexual relations within marriage. While many cultures have profaned God's gift of sexuality, the biblical approach not only validates the beauty of sexuality within the purpose of God's design, but it also warns against the dangers of its abuse. Song of Songs uses sexual imagery to convey to us the beauty and truth that God's approach to sexuality is pure, appropriate, and encouraged in a marital relationship, because everything God created was good. The book models mutuality, submissive sexual behavior between a loving couple. It affirms a wholesome enjoyment in the marriage bed. The song, therefore, is didactic and moral in its purpose. It comes to us in this world of sin, where lust and passion are on every hand, where fierce temptations assail us and try to turn us aside from the God-given standard of marriage. And it reminds us in specifically beautiful fashion how pure and noble true love really is. The outline of Song of Songs can be broken down into 6 poems, and you'll find this in your worksheet. So poem 1 is "The Bride Longs for Her Groom." The second poem is "The Lovers Seek and Find Each Other." The third poem is "The Wedding Procession and Marriage." The fourth poem is "The Bride Fears She Will Lose the Groom." The fifth poem is "The Groom Describes the Bride's Beauty." And in the sixth poem, we see the nature of love. So that concludes our look at the wisdom and poetic books. Now let's look at our homework for the week. So your homework for the week is to read Ecclesiastes or Song of Songs. You should read each outline section, so like 1, 2, like that, in your worksheet, in one setting. If you choose to read it all together, that's fine, but at least read those parts together because it will help with the flow of thought. Also, if you choose to use an audio Bible, that's completely fine too. What I find myself doing sometimes, especially when I'm going through books where there's a lot of repetition or a lot of hard names or things like that, is I'll actually listen to the audio Bible while I read along in an actual Bible. Now, if you do that, just make sure that you have the same translation, like New International Version, King James Version, English Standard Version, whatever you have. But it's completely fine to use an audio Bible. If you want to listen to it all the way through and then maybe read it, whatever you decide, that's great. The main thing is that you get something out of it, not that you just check it off a list or, say that you did your homework for the week. If it takes you longer than a week, that's completely fine too. The main thing is that you read it and that you get something out of it. Now, let's review today's lesson. Question 1, what are the key characteristics of Proverbs? Proverbs have parallelism and numbers. They are intended as generalizations. They are designed and intended to teach the wisest way to live. Question 2, who were the authors of Proverbs? It was mainly Solomon, also Augur and King Lemuel, perhaps some others in there. Question 3, when was Proverbs compiled? It was compiled during the time of King Hezekiah. This was around 700 BC. Question 4, what is the first purpose of Proverbs? It is to promote wisdom, understanding, and discipline. Question 5. What must a person do in order to be wise? They need to seek after God with all of their being. Question 6. Who wrote Ecclesiastes and when was it written? While it is often attributed to Solomon, this is really inconclusive, and as for the date, it's really uncertain. So don't make too big of a deal out of it. Question 7. What is the theme of Ecclesiastes? That life without God is empty, useless, and meaningless. Question 8. What does Song of Songs mean? It means that it is the greatest song. Question 9. What are the 3 views held regarding the Song of Songs? So the first would be the love of a husband and wife. The second would be God's love for Israel. The third would be that the bride stood for the church. Question 10. What is the best interpretation of Song of Songs? The love of a husband and wife.